Probably a more interesting and substantial example of this treatment is Fazlur-Rahman's book, Major Themes of the Qur'an. Now, Fazlur-Rahman, apparently he studied in a madrasa system, traditional schools, and then he went on to get a master's degree from the University of Punjab in Lahore and a PhD from Oxford. While he was in Oxford, of course, he fell under the influence of Orientalism, and although, I have no doubt about his being a sincere Muslim, but he did come away from that with a tremendous skepticism about the authenticity of the Sunnah. So his focus is very heavily Qur'an-based, and he doesn't give much credence to the Sunnah, and also, when it comes to tafsir, doesn't give much credence to the statements of the Sahaba about the meaning of verses or asbab al-nuzul or anything like that. He, after studying at Oxford, he taught at McGill, which is a major Orientalist department, McGill in Montreal, Canada. Eventually he went back to Pakistan to head the Central Institute for Islamic Research in Islamabad from 62, I believe, to 68. His modernist, his approach, with some kind of, the influence of Orientalist thinking in his writing and in his views, made him a sort of a lightning rod for a lot of criticism. And eventually things just became so uncomfortable for him that he ended up leaving Pakistan to take up a teaching post at the University of Chicago, 1969, and he continued to hold that post until his death in 1988, rahimahullah. He explains the need for writing this book, The Major Themes of the Qur'an. He says he wanted to present the ideas of the Qur'an, especially for non-Muslims, English-speaking non-Muslims, in a way that would make the coherence and the thematic unity of its teachings clear. And he said that, traditional tafsirs, they get so lost in the detail, plus they tend to be tendentious, means, they have an axe to grind. And so they don't do the job. And so he organized his book into 8 chapters, with each one of them having a theme. The first is God. Second, man as individual. Third, man in society. Fourth, nature. Fifth, prophethood and revelation. The sixth, eschatology, means what happens after death. Satan and evil. And number 8, emergence of the Muslim community. And then he has 2 appendices, one on the religious situation of the Muslim community in Mecca, and second, the people of the book and the diversity of religions, which deals more with the situation in Medina. I'll just look at Appendix 1 as an example of how he approaches a topic and develops it. So he starts out with this question that the Orientalists are always discussing. They take it for granted that Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that he got the subject matter, the themes, and the stories of the previous prophets from the Jews or the Christians, and that these ideas were sort of floating around in the Arabian Peninsula, and he just sort of repackaged them. And then he mentions that there's somebody named Bell, a British man, who his thesis was that the source of these stories were the Christians, and there's another Orientalist named Torrey whose thesis is that the Jews were the source of these stories and these ideas. And then he mentions with pretty clear, it's an implied disapproval. He says none of them ever even considers the idea that this could be revelation from God. But then he goes on to try to analyze, just what kind of a Jewish and Christian presence was there in Mecca before Islam and in the Meccan period, Meccan period of the revelation. And he points out, we know for sure that there was historical evidence, very extensive, that there was a Jewish community in Medina, a Jewish community in Khaybar. We know what happened to them. There's nothing really in Seerah literature, Hadith literature about Jews in Mecca. There's mentioned Ibn Ishaq that there were 3 Qurayshis in the pre-Islamic era who accepted Christianity. But there's no real mention of Jews. But then he goes and he says, okay, well, let's examine the Qur'an to see what can we get from the Qur'an, specifically the Meccan surahs, about this idea that the Quraysh were familiar with the ideas, the teachings of the people of the book. And he finds pretty clear evidence for it. In Surah Al-Mu'minun, verses 82 and 83, just read the English, they say, when we are dead and have become mere dust and bones, will we then forsooth be raised again? We were already promised this, we and our forefathers. Indeed, this is nothing but fables of the men of old. So if they were promised that they would be resurrected, who was promising them that? The pagan Arabs rejected that. So who was promising them that? Clearly, the Jews and the Christians. And then he takes a somewhat controversial stance with regard to a verse in Surah Al-An'am. Now, with An'am, there are some reports that say it was revealed all at once. It's clearly a Meccan surah, but there are some reports also from Ibn Abbas and some of the professors of the Tabi'een that there were a few verses that were revealed in Medina, and one of them is the verse that we're about to discuss. The translation says, and they did not estimate God with correct estimation when they said, God has not sent down anything on a human. This is Fazlur-Rahman's translation. Say, who sent down the book which Moses brought as a light and guidance for mankind, which you write down in parchments, showing them to people, but hiding much thereof, and whereby you have been taught what neither you nor your forefathers knew? Say, God, then leave them freelancing in their discussion. It's verse 92. Now, there is a narration about the Sabab Nuzul that the Prophet ﷺ, he was discussing something with a Jewish rabbi, and this man happened to be quite heavy-set, fat. And he said to him, I adjure you by the Torah, didn't the Torah condemn fat rabbis? And now this particular rabbi was there in a delegation, and he said, Wallahi, Allah did not reveal anything to a human being. And these other rabbis with him said, what are you saying? And then this verse was revealed. So he got angry because of this. He was sort of being backed into a corner by the Prophet ﷺ on a personal issue. Anyway, that's something that's mentioned as Sabab Nuzul. I didn't take the time to investigate the authenticity of the attribution. But anyway, Fazlur-Rahman's thesis, he says that this verse is primarily addressed to the pagan Arabs, okay, because he says Al-An'am is a Meccan surah. And then the address shifts to the Jews who were present in Mecca. He mentions that there are some people who say, well, part of it is talking about the Meccan pagans, and part of it's talking about the Jews in Medina. He said that's absurd to say that part of a verse was revealed in Mecca and part of it was revealed in Medina. When it's one coherent unit. Difficult to swallow that. And basically he's relying on the fact that this is a Makkan surah. So he says it's a Makkan surah and there's an address there to, the whole context previous to it is talking to the pagan Arabs, so that continues at the beginning of the verse and then it shifts to the Jews. But he says these Jews must have been present in Makkah. I should also point out that al-Qurtubi does acknowledge the possibility that this is a Meccan verse and not a Medinan verse. Anyway, Fazlur-Rahman goes on to say the second point is that despite the exposure of the pagan Arabs to Jewish and Christian teachings, they had proved virtually impervious to them. And he cites another Meccan surah. But when the truth from us came to them, they said, why has he not been given the like of what Moses was given? Did they not already reject what Moses had been given before? That would be Surah Qasas, verse 48. And then he cites Ash-Shu'ara, 97, to argue his third point, that there was a small number of Jews in the Meccan era who offered the Prophet ﷺ a certain degree of moral support. The translation says, was it not a sign for them that the learned men of the children of Israel recognized him? Again, Shu'ara is a Meccan surah. Now, al-Qurtubi, he says that Ibn Abbas said that the pagan Meccans, they sent a delegation to Medina to ask the Jews about Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and they sent back word that time period was the era that the prophet that they had been waiting for was supposed to appear, and that Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam seemed to match the descriptions. Allahu A'lam. And then he cites a verse from Surah al-Ra'd. Those to whom we had already given the book rejoice in what has been sent to you. And among the sectarians, the Ahzab, there are those who deny some of it. And yet another verse, and even thus have we sent down to you the book. Those whom we had already given the book believe in it. Qur'an. And among these ones, that is the generality of the Jews too, they are those who believe in it. So, there's some small group being alluded to from among the Jews who accept the Qur'an. So if we accept that these verses in these Meccan surahs are indeed Meccan verses, then he establishes some basis for entertaining his idea. And that, so these messianic expectations of the Jews, his idea is that they're talking about that it psychologically prepared the Meccans who did accept Islam for accepting the Prophet ﷺ. And then he makes a final point, which is, he says, not every reference, the basic rule is that if a surah or a verse mentions jihad and hypocrisy, that it's a Medinan surah. And he challenges that on the basis of the beginning of Surah al-Ankabut. Now, it's well known, he doesn't mention it, but it's well known, all the Muslim commentators agree that verse 52 from Surah al-Furqan is a Meccan verse. وَجَاهِدْهُمْ بِهِ جِهَادًا كَبِيرًا. The beginning of the verse goes, do not obey the disbelievers, but strive against them by it, meaning the Qur'an. A tremendous struggle. جَاهِدْهُمْ بِهِ جِهَادًا كَبِيرًا. But the one that he quotes, and that's clearly, jihad meaning dawah. And it's a Meccan verse. At the beginning of Surah al-Ankabut, some of the relevant verses, do people imagine that they will be left at ease because they said, we believe and will not be tested with affliction? Indeed, we tested those who were before you. Thus Allah knows those who are sincere and knows those who make a show. Those are verses 2 and 3. And then verse 6 says, and whoever strives only for himself. And the verb there is jahad, yujahidu. And then of mankind is he who says, we believe in Allah. But if he be made to suffer for the sake of Allah, he mistakes the persecution of mankind for Allah's punishment. And then if victory comes from your Lord, will say, indeed, we are with you. Is not Allah best aware of what is in the bosoms of his creatures? Verily, Allah knows those who believe, and verily, he knows the hypocrites. So, his contention here is that hypocrites doesn't mean the kind of hypocrites that were there in Medina, but that hypocrisy here is people who they had some kind of shakiness in their belief, and as a result, when there was fitna, and fitna, he points out that fitna has a meaning in Medina and it has a different meaning in Makkah. In Makkah, it was like pressure, either psychological or physical, to revert from Islam to the ancestral religion. So that those people who succumbed to that, it was due to some kind of weakness in their heart, and that this weakness was related to hypocrisy. So, this is something that's, it's worth looking at, it's worth considering. Take it with a grain of salt, examine it critically, and see what you think. And Allah knows best. But to me, this whole approach and this whole the nuggets of insight that it offers are really valuable and worthy of consideration overall. Though, as Imam Malik said, كُلًّا يُؤْخَذُ مِنْ كَلَامِهِ وَيُرَدْ إِلَّا صَاحِبِ هَذَا الْقَبْرِ. Everyone, there's something that can be accepted from his statements and other things that would be rejected, except for the inhabitant of this grave. And Imam Malik was sitting in the Prophet's masjid when he said that, so he was pointing to the grave of the Prophet ﷺ. And Allah knows best. Subhanakallahumma wa bihamdik, ashhadu an la ilaha illa anta, astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi.